Welcome to the session. My name is Nadine Blayney, and it is my pleasure to be the host for today's session on Super. Joining me today are four forward-thinking leaders from across the superannuation industry. In today's session, we're going to be discussing key challenges and, of course, opportunities that super funds are facing, the shift towards target operating models that are driving great efficiencies, and the opportunities for differentiating in a crowded marketplace. And to discuss all of that, I'm delighted to welcome our panel today. Joining me in studio is Andrew Walsh, who is CEO of financial technology company Iress. We've got Mark Puli, who's the CEO of ESSSuper, Sheena Peeters, General Manager of Technology at HESTA, and Martin Fahy, who is the CEO of the Association for Superannuation Funds. Welcome to you all. Now, I will be asking the panel questions primarily, but we will be taking questions from you at the end of the session. Please feel free to send them through via the Q&A tab throughout the event, and we will get to them in due course. So let's start, shall we? I'd like to start with a question open to you all. Andrew, because you're here, it's easiest to start with you. What do you define as the top, I guess, challenge or opportunity that are facing super funds over the next 2 to 3 years? So putting that timeline on it, what do you think has to be done right?
Well, certainly I think differentiation in a crowded marketplace, and that marketplace is not exclusively within superannuation. I think standing out as a financial services provider to an everyday Australian is a real challenge for every fund as they think about their constituency, but also understanding what is the operating model for the future. What do they need to do for the next 5 years as they compete, differentiate, stand out, reduce cost, or at least perform better? So I think there's a challenging environment where all these things are coming at funds at once, not least to mention regulation and the politicization of super that's in the paper every day.
Well, it's in the paper today, isn't it? Martin, over to you on that question. Differentiation, what's top of your list when you think about the challenges and opportunities over the next 2 to 3 years?
I think the big challenge for me is the cost to serve and how we drive down the cost to serve. In the face of increased regulatory pressures to reduce fees, your super tests, and the ATO portal and stapling, I think there's going to be enormous pressure on funds to drive down the cost to serve. And that in turn is going to take funds into the realm of simplification of processes, standardization of processes, and automation and digitization of processes. And it's only through that, driving down the cost to serve and being very, very, I think, targeted in terms of standardization and automation, that funds will be able to harvest the benefits of scale and get to the level of fees that they need. Because I think differentiation on fees is going to become a really, really big part of it. It's going to be table stakes going forward.
And Sheena, how do you handle that at HESTA in terms of challenges, opportunities? And it sounds like differentiation of fees is front of mind as well.
Martin mentioned cost to serve and specifically around automation. So, our future strategy is going to have to be a balance of member experience, but automation as well, particularly around process and process transparency. One of our areas of focus at the moment is to ensure that we've got the right data available at the right points in time to the right people in the right channels, so that we can actually move towards that automation and ensure that we have real transparency when we're managing members and when we're helping our members, and moving more and more towards that efficiency, which ultimately then reduces or addresses the cost to serve.
Mm-hmm. Efficiencies, data, automation. Last on the list to ask is Mark Puli, CEO of ESSSuper. Where is your thinking in terms of both the challenges and opportunities in that sort of short to medium term?
Sure. So firstly, I'd say the competition's on the rise. So we've seen fund stapling rules come out. We've seen a lot of regulatory change, which means you need to be able to differentiate as a super fund. So innovation is through insight, and insight is through quality data. The other thing I would say is we all know the focus regulators have had on making sure we get things right and the mistakes we saw through the Royal Commission. Automation can actually help you not make those same mistakes. And so, technology platforms are critical to take us forward to, one, meet all our compliance requirements, but secondly, to really be able to help our members in the future.
Mark, staying with you, from your perspective, who's responsible for transformation of the super fund? So executing some of these issues that we've just been speaking of. Is it, the boards, the CEOs, the heads of techs? Where does the responsibility really lie?
So the responsibility, typically what happens is the board sets the strategy and the strategic direction, and that's based on a vision for what an organisation wants to achieve. So, management works very closely with the board in a relationship to make that happen. But it's not management that the responsibility ultimately lives with, it's actually with the whole organisation. Because to make organisational change is actually hard for everyone. And so you need everyone on board to make that change. So, constantly through change is communication and making sure that you're all working towards the same purpose. The responsibility is given to us by members. Members now demand better service. They demand technology that's not necessarily in superannuation, but technology that they're using, and we've seen that more and more through the COVID environment. So really, it's upon all of us to make innovation and technology work for our advantage.
Martin, now that we've got you back, something that you've been speaking about for a number of years is the need for super funds to work toward a new target operating model. So what exactly is it that you mean by that?
So what we mean by that is how funds organize themselves everywhere from the channel through to the pricing through to how they organize their service delivery model in terms of what gets internalized, what gets externalized. In the case of sort of middle and back office and the admin area, which is probably the focus of what we were talking about today, it's a lot to do with process placement, what gets done where by whom. And I think in deploying target operating models, many people think purely in terms of internalization and deployment of new solutions. I think from my point of view, that the challenge with deploying new target operating models is that I think historically there's been a mistake in superannuation funds ecosystem that high levels of customer engagement and member engagement and intimacy, lots of kind of conversations on contact center, etc. That's been associated with somehow being good member engagement. I think the reality is when we look internationally at what good looks like, in many cases what good looks like is that it's a process that's been atomized, industrialized, and is signified by a very low coefficient of friction and runs straight through. And as a result of that, it's sometimes, within the operating unit, it's arbitraging technology for labor and does require very, very difficult decisions in terms of driving standardization and almost a zealous approach to driving out non-standard processes. And to Mark's point, that then facilitates, zero tolerance for errors and allows you to drive Six Sigma type processes. In the case of, I think, funds, the big decisions on target operating models is around process placement. What gets done where by whom, who has coverage over the process, and who owns the process standardization. I think the mistake, a lot of transformation programs come from is that people believe that they're in the happiness business. We're not in the happiness business. It's not about whether that customer who rang up on the call center is happy. It's about the 99% of people who didn't ring. Are they happy? Or are they just disengaged? And how do we manage to see that frictionless straight through processing? If good looks like anything, I think it looks like the technology that we experience at home in everyday lives. We've got to the stage with our apps and our mobile devices and ubiquitous mobility that we expect the service providers that we deal with on a day-to-day basis to resemble the services that we consume in our private life. And that's the high watermark for superannuation funds in terms of target operating models.
Andrew, UX, user experience. I mean, that's what we're talking about.
We're talking about user experience for those that are within the fund and members that are outside the fund. I think one of the dangers of defining simply an operating model is if that's done before the fund understands who they are and what they do and what differentiates them, they could end up automating a process that shouldn't exist anyway. And so I think the understanding what is available, what can be productized, what's commoditized, and therefore what should the fund focus on that differentiates them in the eyes of members and returns needs to be presupposed before the operating model can then optimize how the fund works. And having those done in order is really important. Strategy before execution.
Yeah, so you are obviously a partner to super funds. So is that what's really holding them back from making the most of investments being made in technology?
Well, I think that the decisions that Martin is describing and what I'm describing are existential for some funds and are important to be future ready. And they are big decisions. They need to have enough time putting them. They are hard decisions. They might involve the employed base of the fund. I think that those are the first things that are holding up some of these decisions, yes.
Mark, ESSSuper is about to go live with a new approach to super administration. It's really centered around technology and automation, from what I am being told. Where did that process begin? Where did the strategizing begin? What questions, I suppose, did you ask yourself before this whole process in terms of what really needed to be adopted?
I think where we started, Andrew made this point, is what's your strategic vision? What's your purpose? What are you trying to actually achieve as a fund? We had an antiquated technology stack, and there's only so much lipstick you can put on that pig before you actually have to look at the core underneath it. So we did that. And then what we did is we asked ourselves, well, what's actually important to the membership? What really matters to them? Because it's amazing how we just assume in our industry very easily, oh, this is what we think members want. This is what they demand. This is what they need. So we went and actually asked them. And we found out a few home truths, which was, and this won't surprise any of you who've got an ATM and a card and now a mobile phone to access cash, is that what people told us is they wanted it to be seamless. And that was really core, is the stuff that's important to them really matters. And that's where the people need to be focused, and the stuff that is expected just to happen should just happen. So that's where we started. Then what we did is we said, well, what does the rest of the industry do? And we analysed the whole industry. And then we said, okay, what do the best customer service organisations across the broader market do? And we looked at it through their lens. And it was amazing how different we are. And I think it'll be amazing how congruent and how these things come together over time. After doing that, of course, we go through the RFP and the tender process, but engaging your board all along that journey, because it's not just you're changing an administration platform, you're actually changing the way you operate as a fund. Explore the market options, and importantly, make a decision and then drive it hard.
How long has that process taken up to now?
I would always say to you, it always takes far too long, but importantly, it has to take as long as it needs to get all your stakeholders on board. Because when you go through transformation, it's hard work, and you want to be sure that everyone is signed up to it and engaged. So, very early on, we discussed it with the board. We went through many iterations to make sure, because we're setting ourselves up for the next 20 years of success, the next 5 minutes. And then bringing staff on the journey early is also critically important. So it's taken a long time, but I wouldn't have done it any differently. You need to go in with forethought and wisdom into any change process, and you need to be prepared for whatever it throws at you. And just back to sort of Martin's earlier point, it's amazing when you've had technology that you've had in place for over 30 years and you put a lot of stuff around it, how many bespoke little solutions you have, which actually need to be blown away to be standardised and made simple.
Sheena, what's HESTA's philosophy when it comes to technology and the adoption of new technology, of course?
So we've been on a journey of cloud and getting the foundations right. And I think, if I lean on what Martin and Mark have said, we think about that we will achieve efficiency through automation. Leveraging cloud technologies is a key for us to drive that. And largely because it helps with velocity. So, part of this process is to not only change, but change with a level of experimentation and agility. And so we've focused a lot on getting our cloud foundations right. And the second part of that is to also have access to data really efficiently. Martin talked a little bit about, looking at your target operating model and placement of process and the right process for the right time in the right structure, right? So if you think about your value chain, we focus a lot on the front end of the customer value chain, but realigning the servicing value chain to support that is really critical to achieving that automation, but then having access to the data to realize the outcomes for customers, to provide answers at the right points in time, not just through people, but through technology, is going to be key for us. And getting our foundations right is critical to drive that change.
Okay, now all of this does not happen without cost. And I know Martin touched upon the challenges that a lot of funds face when it comes to, transformation, budgeting, the reality of the real world. So how do funds, I guess, ensure that they're getting the balance right when it comes to investing in new ways of working and spending what is members' money? How do you approach that at HESTA, Sheena?
I think understanding what the strategy is, being really, really focused on, how we drive to that outcome, and being able to explain the reduction in cost over time, I think it will be key, right? So, it's really, really important that we manage or service our members effectively. And that is through a very transparent and a really streamlined process. Investing and achieving that is equally as important, but achieving it effectively and doing it well, I think, as Mark said, in a really strategic and systematic way is what we want to drive towards. And you're right, we're investing members' money. We need to be mindful, but what we don't want to be doing is continuing to perpetuate a process or an outcome that is inefficient and that is costly. So we can't always rely on what we've all done traditionally, which is to work through people or to work through, handoffs, manual handoffs and inefficiency. And our members expect us to be there. As Martin pointed out, the service expectations that we all have are not based on the super industry. They're based on the best experiences that we have, whether it's through our apps, whether it's through, shopping online, which I think a lot of us have done, paying our bills efficiently, accessing our banking, in really accessible ways. We want our super to be as efficient as well, right? So, we've got to find effective ways to do that. As I mentioned before, we're leveraging cloud to help us. The other thing with cloud technology as well is that it allows us to do experimentations. So gone are the days where we want to invest in really lengthy projects where we come out the other side. We find that, either people's expectations have changed or scope wasn't quite right to start with. So experimentation is going to be really important to ensure that we invest really effectively.
Mm-hmm. And that goes to that nimble sort of argument, correct?
It does. It goes to agility and it goes to differentiation, responsiveness in the market. And the ability to experiment relies on having a wholly automated operating model. And so understanding how that high transaction engine can work and be relied upon, and that differentiation happens at the edge. I think the conservatism and the approach that super funds take to protection also needs to evolve so that you can protect high frequency operating model and innovate at the edge, because you certainly can't innovate end to end. That's too expensive and too risky.
Mm-hmm. Mark, you started this whole transformation by speaking with members. How has that conversation evolved? How do you continue that conversation around the investment that's needed in technology and that is being made on behalf of members?
Yeah, so definitely. And I think through COVID, we've seen members' expectations around that increase even more. We've got obligations, as you all would, as super funds, to keep your members informed of what you're doing and what changes you're making. I think funds have focused on things like investment costs in the past, which naturally makes good sense. I do think that the industry will turn to administration costs. But importantly for members, the cost of administration is not just the headline rate, it's the potential for hidden costs of super funds not keeping them informed, super funds making errors. That's a hidden cost that automation helps it address and solve. And if anything, we know from the Royal Commission that you've got to get these things right. And so, the cost is not just the headline cost, it's all those hidden costs that sit underneath. And automation brings down the cost for everyone. That's the really key point here is, Sheena talked about insight with data and data warehouses and cloud computing. Leveraging not only the benefits of automation of administration, but the insights you get from that actually drives down costs further across your whole business.
Martin, how is governance changing around investments and change?
I think I think the viewers will understand this, the reality is that our degrees of freedom, particularly in the MySuper space, are very, very constrained. The government has clearly set out a set of benchmarks that will be used to assess fund performance in terms of investment returns. The government, through Your Future, Your Super, has very clearly decided that admin fees are part of that mix, not your historic admin fees, but your go-forward admin fees. And through best financial interest duty, I think brand and marketing expenditure is going to be subject to scrutiny. So I think it's interesting. Competition, I think, is changing from competition in the market to competition for the market. The government has decided that from a governance point of view, the member's utility function has a single variable in it, which is the best financial interest of the member and their ultimate retirement balance. And so I think we need to be careful, and I think it's a really good point that's been made, is that differentiation, I think, will happen on the fringes. In the MySuper space in particular, this will be about scale, efficiency, and so the governance needs to speak to that. So if we see the first set of Your Future, Your Super performance tests and where funds landed, and we look at the heat maps and we look at the choice heat maps that are coming out, and the second round of performance tests, I think fund trustees are going to have a governance are going to have a very focused, really rifled focus on admin fees, on the cost to serve, and as Mark has said, on a zero tolerance for errors from a compliance point of view. In terms of the expenditure, I think one of the things we have to acknowledge, though, is that funds don't have big balance sheets. While they may have a lot of funds under management, as organizations, their balance sheets are actually quite skinny. Their ability to fund large capital investment programs in IT, their ability to run very large transformation programs is very often constrained. And so what that means is that we have to be able to do more with less. But I think we're also going to have to lean on technology and service providers more. In some cases, cloud has facilitated, obviously, reducing capital investment in return for annual ongoing operating costs. But I also think in terms of retiring out redundant technology that maybe is on-premise, that's still held on the balance sheet, service providers and technology providers may have to put their balance sheets in play. And we've seen that happen in other sectors where, in order to accelerate the journey across to the new target operating model, it's been necessary for the service provider to write a check, to take across the on-prem technology at the value that it's carried in the balance sheet, and then provide on a sale and leaseback a renewed operating model. And I think that's going to be a feature going forward. Funds are going to have limited capital to deploy into large-scale on-prem, or even to build out technology, and they're going to want to rent that technology as a service in a SaaS model.
All right, look, I know we could discuss that further, Andrew, chomping at the bit, but I would like to shift now to member engagement, because it's been a core focus for super funds for many years. But how successful has the industry been? What does member engagement look like in the new year, 2022 and beyond? Mark, we'll start with you. How are you approaching member engagement within your fund?
Sure. So I'll firstly say that engagement is a constant challenge, no matter who you are in the industry, but it's something we can never give up on. So we're fortunate enough at ESSSuper to have one of the highest member satisfaction rates across the industry. And it's really about a couple of things. I would say to you that you need to be available to your membership when they need you. And so when they're asking you, and they don't even know they're asking you, be available to them. The other thing I would say is sometimes they don't know what they need. And this is where the expertise of superannuation funds can come in, and all the experts that work in our funds is predictive analytics. Thinking about what they need before they know they need it is pretty cool. And so more and more, I think we're seeing the world move to that space. I don't think it's fast enough, but there's this sort of sense of pent-up demand, and maybe it's this post-COVID world that we're entering, that we all realise that member engagement online is actually successful. We had no choice, and we were forced to use online engagement. And I think what you'll see is that that is going to shift the thinking of all the super funds. It shifts the thinking of our members about what engagement looks like. You know, for a long time in Melbourne, they couldn't go into Myers and they couldn't go into David Jones or into Kmart. And now people are adopting online more than ever before. So that is going to set the pace for the industry to change its ways on member engagement.
Sheena, you know, what's working in terms of member engagement at HESTA?
Look, we're fortunate to have really good member engagement at HESTA. We're also fortunate to have really strong insights and information that we can leverage, right, to support and service our members. Going forward though, and I feel like I've leaned on this before, it'll be about being present when our members expect us and need help, but being consistent. So through every channel, being able to deliver to our members in a really consistent way, whether they're engaging online, whether they're engaging through an app, or whether they're engaging over the phone. And having that information available to all of those channels. Our members engage across channels, right? So we can't assume that they will come to one channel and finish or have the answers that they need. If they are traversing across channels as well, it will be important to ensure that we are available across all those channels in the right way. And I think that's where the expectation will be, or it is there already. So it's up to us to ensure that we can continue to evolve our experience. Being digital isn't enough. It's ensuring that we're digital, we're digitizing as much as we can to make information and to make help available where it's meaningful to our members, and that we're also present through other channels, channels of choice.
Technology, it sounds like, Andrew, really foundational.
It's the underpin, and engagement is like the icing on the cake. I think up until now, funds have experimented with tools and ideas to test out member engagement, but until the operating model is there, it's really difficult and really expensive to get engagement right. My view of member engagement in the future will be like personalization has happened in the retail space, that it won't be as consistent as it has been in the past. It won't be benefit statements once a year. It'll be real time. It'll be proactive. It'll be finding the member where they're at, when they're at. And so the ability to understand data and get insights about individual members, not cohorts, to know what's happened in their life and be proactive. And so I think the big test is on personalization in super. When does that happen? How does that happen? And what's the model on which it operates?
The future, it's the brave new world. Martin, how do you view member engagement, and importantly, where it starts, and I suppose it's never finished?
Accept absolutely everything thinking about, but the main exposure people get is engagement with the category, not their fund. On a day-to-day basis, people's exposure to superannuation comes through the category, not the fund. And so what I mean by that is that our media channels, if you look at the level of coverage, our media channels are full of discussions of superannuation. They're not talking about your fund, they talk about the category. And in an era where superannuation is ideological and where the super wars as a vernacular has become normalized, in many cases, the challenge I think you will have is that their main ongoing day-to-day encounter with superannuation will be initially with the category, not your fund. And so I think it's really going to be very, very challenging. And that category encounter will be, yes, through the ideology of politics, but also through issues around net zero, through issues around conversations around ESG, and not with your fund. And so I think what we're going to get is an interesting situation where people will have a perception of the category, and they may have a perception of their fund. But you, I think, as a fund, will have to be able to manage both of those things. And I think very often a member coming to you will be coming to you not off the back of something that you've done or an event within your data. The data actually will sit externally. So in terms of insights, you may get a phone call where somebody says, well, Is my fund invested in coal? What's my fund's trajectory for net zero? That data sits in the external context, not in your internal data. So I think we just need to be careful that we understand that super exists within a context, and that context is of a category, and that category has a different issue in terms of social license and those things. So what I caution funds is, yes, I understand analytics, yes, I understand insights, but the event that may trigger the engagement with you may actually emerge outside your fund, with data that you need to monitor just as closely as you do. So be wary of contamination from the category to your fund in terms of member engagement.
Okay, now we all know that advisor numbers are declining in Australia, even though we're also told that there is a growing need for Australians to access quality advice. Mark, let's start with you. Is it the role of super funds to pick up the slack here? I mean, is that essentially what you're doing?
So I think more and more superannuation funds do have a role to play in this space. And look, you know, there's a lot of providers of financial advice out there. I'll probably start with by saying that we need to work with the regulators around what the future of digital advice looks like. Because typically what we see in regulation is regulators, you know, by default almost look backwards at the mistakes of the past to try and address them in the future. There's a real opportunity in the digital space to think of what the future mistakes may be and address them now in order to free up the industry to go digital. I mean, the reality is the world is going digital. You know, automating the low value add, like an administration, you know, automation is key. You know, why do you want to sit with a financial advisor and have to fill out forms? Why not have your systems do that for you? In fact, if you don't actually need to see face-to-face a financial advisor, why not be able to do that online? What if you can't afford financial advice? What if you don't need full-scale financial advice? So how you get that balance right really needs us to leverage off technology. And even with complex advice, utilising technology to make it as simple and seamless as possible is really important. You need to make people available to be efficient. You know, sometimes talking to a computer is not going to fully help you or not satisfy the individual's needs. So complementing technology with people when you need to is really, really important.
Yeah, because Andrew, technology can't do it all.
Technology can't do it all, and there are some decisions that we all make that we want to verify. And we've seen robo-advice evolve over the last few years, and the high propensity for people to drop out at the last stage is critical. And most of these robo-advisors internationally have added humans to the process. Over the past few years, super funds have been the largest acquirers of human-based financial planners, but now we're seeing funds that are blending that, delivering personalized, enactable advice through a web browser or through a mobile phone, and they have advisors there to verify, validate that someone has done the right thing. I think it's the future, and it's the only way to deliver more advice to more Australians economically.
Yeah, Sheena, thoughts on that? Because of course, regulation's always changing. It feels like that's not going to end.
So we have, you know, it's, and we need to work with our regulators, right, through all of the things that we're trying to do. But we need to make information available to people. And ultimately, advice is just that, right? It's information that our members may or may not understand. So it's incumbent on us to present it in a meaningful way, whether it's through digital or whether it's through people. I think digitization and leveraging technology and working with our regulators to do it effectively provides greater accessibility to those who may or may not be able to access it, particularly through advisors. And I think Mark touched on this as well. So we see a real opportunity to provide our members with the right information so they can take action or be informed. But also there's so much other data that will become accessible, banking information, you know, through open banking. So what does that all mean, I think, for the future? Because people don't live just, you know, with their super doesn't exist in a bubble, right? It exists in context of their lives. There are a whole bunch of things that all individuals, decisions that individuals are making. So how do you take or help bring together that holistic set of information to help them be informed? And I think that's where, you know, leveraging technology to actually churn through all that information in a meaningful way, and then being able to present it through different means, I think that will become really important going forward.
And Martin, just a final thought on that, because is it desirable for future funds to be providing that type of advice at scale, again, with the ever-changing regulatory environment?
Look, there used to be 10,000 bellhops in New York. We've had, electrification required people to go around and, street lighting in the US required people to go around and turn on the lights. And at one point in time, there was a view that the world would never have more than 2 million cars, because no more than 2 million people will be willing to be chauffeurs. The reality is, I think, is our views on advice are locked within the current paradigm. And I think part of the challenge is that paradigm is not going to serve us well going forward. It's overly influenced by products, it's overly influenced by singularities of retirement and events, etc. And I think the point that's been made is that in the short term, it's going to be a blended approach, but I think in the long term, I think what's going to happen is that a generation of 30-something-year-olds are not going to, I think, sign up to a world of advice where they don't have agency and where they're unempowered and where they can't make decisions. I think the challenge for superannuation funds is that the constant tinkering with the system makes it very, very difficult. I think one of the worrying trends at the moment in the retirement space is that even though we have a retirement income covenant that talks about strategy, every single retirement income provider keeps talking about products. And so we have an industry that wants to sell products. We have a regulator that wants to take people through a process. And I think we have a world where we need to rethink advice as to what it is. Is it a process, or is it just purely finding Nurofen for the pain that people feel in the face of uncertainty? Funds, I think, will be better served by, I think, maybe thinking that for the next 3 or 4 years, the regulatory uncertainty, the review of advice, the penalty regimes that are in place, I think is going to make large funds very gun shy on advice. I think trustees are going to want attestations, assurance, and they're going to want artifacts around all the advice that's going out the door. That's going to make it very, very challenging for funds to deliver. And so I think what we're going to see at the moment is a pulling back before we get some certainty. I think in the absence of that certainty, the risk reward to major investments in the advice space are very, very uncertain.
Okay, I would like to remind everyone that we will be taking your questions. So I'm seeing a few coming in. Keep them coming, and we'll do that at the end of the panel discussion. And of course, you can do that via the Q&A function that you see on your screen. So we'll do that in just a moment. In the meantime, though, I'd like to just talk about the future and really get into blue sky thinking in terms of what super funds will look like in the future. And to do that, I mean, Mark, clear your mind. If there were no barriers, think cost and regulation and time. What do you think the future fund of this, the super fund of the future, Mark, would look like?
I think importantly, predictive analytics I've spoken about a lot, but actually making that real. And so, we always talk about data insights and what we can get out of the information that we have. But, nothing would please me more to say, we contact a member and they go, oh, thank goodness you've rung me. Or thank goodness digitally you've got engaged with me. I need help with something. Super funds at the moment, they publish a lot of information and they aerial bombard with leaflets and pamphlets and initiatives. Believe it or not, people don't want to talk about superannuation every day. And so when they do want to talk about it, wouldn't it be great if we are there and we know that they want to talk about it and we can predict that and we can engage with them? It does a couple of things. It makes sure that when members are engaged, they're fully engaged. It also helps the super fund manage the expectations of its members and be successful in its own right. So I really see that will be the future of where the world goes. I think the other thing is and Sheena sort of touched on this a little bit, is this sort of seamless integration across multiple platforms. Superannuation at the end of the day is a financial mechanism to help people with their retirement. And it it's one of many financial mechanisms we have. Now, we've seen group life insurance incorporated over time, but people have bank accounts. They have all sorts of lending facilities they can have. And I do see seamless integration to take out the effort where effort doesn't need to be is going to be really important. And I'm hoping that that's what the future holds for us.
Yeah, it brings a smile to your face. Andrew, that stood out to me as well. You know, you bring in open banking into the conversation, your design for personalization of super, and really you can see funds transformed.
Yeah, I can see a future where a super fund is wholly relevant to not just the member, not just superannuation, but the family. And I think that is going to be the fulfilling experience that the fund can provide. And while core principles of superannuation prevent that today, I think that's what it will look like in time. And so how does the super fund operate in order to set that up? What you don't want is an open banking future that drags funds into portability, open access for data, open access for APIs on the way in. And so I think that it certainly will take forward steps by progressive funds to get there first.
Mm-hmm. And so, Sheena, how you think of the future? I mean, will super funds and the way they operate, the way that they engage be completely different if we look further into the future?
I would like to, I'm a technologist, right? So I'd like to see us tap into the technologies that not only available today, but they will evolve. So, you know, Mark talked about data and predictive analytics, but how do we, that's based on what we know as people, but what about what we don't know? And how do we take all of this data, there's so much of it, and leverage machines and AI and cloud technologies to drive some insights that we may not have known about, that we can then drive products or services through. And how do we use experimentation to do that with a great deal of agility? I think that would be a really, an area that we can explore going forward.
And you see that you're already on that path, Sheena?
I think we're getting the foundations to certainly enable us to leapfrog into that space.
Okay, and Martin, how do you see future funds looking?
Ironically, I think you're far more likely in the future to, and even at present, you're more likely to interact with an asset a future fund, a super fund owns than you are with your super fund.
Say that again, apologies, Martin, just repeat that, just so it's clear.
You're more likely to interact with an asset that your super fund owns than you are with the actual super fund. And so what I mean by that is that in terms of ownership of ports, airports, property, public transport, toll roads, energy company, energy distribution companies, electric recharging networks, healthcare companies, aged care companies, as superannuation grows and goes from its current 2.3 trillion on to 5 trillion by 2032 and on, its presence in the landscape in the Australian economy and in the society will dwarf its presence in my retirement space. The most clear physical manifestation of a fund will be in the real assets and the experiences that we consume as customers, not of the fund, but of the assets that the funds own. How we encounter and engage with those will fundamentally change how we view our fund in terms of what are the values, what's the social license, where does it get that legitimacy, where is it on net zero and all of those things. And so I think as we construct this target operating model, the biggest perception of us as a fund is not how did the phone call go or how was my online digital experience. It will be how did my fund behave in a world where 10 funds will control 90% of the funds under management, and it's a $5 trillion industry. The experience I have with my fund is through the assets they own, primarily, not the fund. And I think as you construct your target operating model, you need to factor that in, because your differentiation will be through how you manifest yourself in their lives as an asset owner, not as a financial services retirement income provider. And that's going to be very, very important. And I think that's where the future will lie, and that's the future challenge.
100%. I mean, what's the core business of a fund.
Yeah.
And it is certainly not processing contributions and redemptions. And those things can be commoditized, they can be automated, they can be outsourced to a high-performing engine. It's the innovation that happens on the edge. It's the assets, the effect onto retirement outcomes that the fund delivers is what it is. And the sooner that we've got clarity of how do funds best perform in that model, the better. It's hard to get to, but it is the future.
Mark, what are your thoughts on that in terms of engagement with the assets owned by the fund and how you look to communicate that?
So we're in a few airports and a few bits and pieces around the world. And importantly, I think, actually, it's often when you talk about investments and investment returns, which is not the topic of today, but often when we explain how we invest members' money, because that is important to them, it is, well, what sort of assets do you buy? And it's funny how you can talk about, equity markets and bond markets and all these things, but when you actually start talking about assets like, to Martin's point, airports, ports, infrastructure that you own, it becomes real to members, and it's actually tangible, shopping centres, those sorts of things. And we often joke with members at our seminars that, have any of you been to Southland Shopping Centre? Well, we own part of that. So when you're paying the car parking fee, some of that's coming back into your fund. So I think this is this affinity of ownership and because ultimately superannuation is about your retirement and what are the assets that you own. But I'd also add that, competitive positioning is not just that. Competitive positioning is seamless service. And ESSSuper is probably a little bit unique. We look after emergency services workers, defined benefit schemes, and there's really only us and UniSuper left as open schemes. But also, the reality is members want us to support them, but they also want to understand what the value proposition of them being with us is. And very much, I think Martin's right, the new battle will move to what are the investments, what is your differentiation?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's fascinating, but let's just stop there and take some questions from those that are listening into this webinar. And I'll start with this one. It says, thank you for discussing the cost of automation. Can you discuss the cost of not automating, particularly against an aging population that will see significant increases in member demand over the coming years? How will funds that do not automate survive this without massive costs impacts? Sheena, I'll start with you.
To be efficient at scale, it is costly if processes are disparate and if the way we manage how we service our members is in a very dysfunctional and disparate format, right? So we know that in order to get efficiency to support members, particularly at scale in a really efficient way, we have to automate and automate the low-hanging fruit. So that doesn't mean that we don't support our members and spend time with them on the things that are meaningful, on the complex services that they need. We want to be able to remove some of the friction out of the services that are pretty simple and straight through. And we should be able to do that with a really great degree of efficiency, which then drives down the cost of service. So I think that the cost of not automating is that over time, you will only see an increase in that cost to serve.
Andrew?
You'll see an increase in cost, and I think the cost of not facing into efficiency and productivity is merger, a world of mergers, and mergers don't solve all problems. You end up with size, you don't end up with scale necessarily unless hard decisions are made. But the future in the aging Australian workforce is a potentially sad one. You have increasing pensioners that don't transact as much, don't need as much, are more focused on fees, and so it becomes very circular. Then you have a younger cohort that is focused on value and cost. There's no one left in the middle, and it could look very dire. And so I think the step is to be proactive and work out how that is approached, talk to service providers as to how they might think of innovative capital arrangements like Martin suggested, and there are certainly many that will be progressive in that thinking. But I think it is do something. It could be very well existential.
Let's get to another question. And I will start with you on this one, Martin. What do you think about the desire by members to have more flexibility around things like investment choice while still being able to achieve scale?
I think there's a very real challenge here. In the next 10 years, after the net equity in people's homes, superannuation will be their largest asset. And a generation of 30-something, 40-year-old somethings are going to expect to have agency, what sociologists call agency, which is a sense of empowerment and control. I think there's been real moves by the current government to talk about that in terms of, conversations around putting crypto in your superannuation, empowering you to make investment decisions. There's a real danger that we'll see the emergence of what I would call, alongside APRA-regulated funds and self-managed super, an era of personalized super, let's call it, where people essentially are taking very, very detailed investment decisions in real time on their funds. I think there's a number of dangers to that. I think general productivity across the economy will be vastly eroded, but I think the investment outcomes for people will be very, very poor. You may feel empowered, but I think that empowerment could actually be very detrimental to the aggregate returns of the system. And so I think we need to be very, very cautious about, what we think is a responsible thing to do. Yes, it's people's money, but the reality is that 200 investment professionals engaged with the world's best fund managers across the obligations is a very, very hard thing to beat. So let me explain. At 6 o'clock this morning, a tradie in Queensland got up and went to work, and they've got $30,000 in their superannuation fund. They can't tell me their superannuation fund, but the reality is they get to invest that $20,000 like Warren Buffett. They get to see some of the best property deals, the best infrastructure deals. They get to invest at scale with global asset managers across a variety of asset class. Long term, it is impossible, however rewarding and fulfilling it might be for an individual with agency making investment decisions, to match that. And we need to be really, really cautious about, I think, this idea that we disintermediate the investment industry, because the fees will be higher and the outcomes will be poorer long term.
Mark, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, you engage with your members and you have been through this process that you've been going through. Are you hearing a lot about investment choice?
It's quite interesting. So we've got a cohort of members who love to dabble. And so they would love to invest in anything that they would like. It's sort of Martin's point. We've got members, what I would say, that are in the middle, and they just go, we trust you, make the investment decisions for us. And often they'll say to us, I can't buy an airport, the super fund can buy it. So we can leverage scale, and we've been talking about scale all throughout. The other thing we find is as members get older, those that when they first retired wanted to dabble and play a little bit in the market, they get older again and they say, gee, this is all too hard. I don't want to do this anymore. So putting aside what Martin said about driving the best investment return outcomes, members like to dabble for a while, but they get to an age where they go, I'm just past it. All I want to do is be safe in retirement, have an income in retirement, and not worry about the detail and trying to keep up with the market. I mean, there's thousands of investment professionals out there that do that. That's their job, and they live and breathe it every day. So we do find this reversion back to people just wanting us to really look after them as they get older.
And Sheena, thoughts on that from you, beyond personalization, more when it comes to different investment options and being able to control that?
I can't speak to it, to be honest with you, Nadine. It's a little bit in a different area to me, but, we're from a technology point of view, which is probably my strength. We can certainly leverage technology over time to support the decisions that the business wants to make in terms of the services, it wants to offer customers. So I think, as we rely on the strategy of the organisation and some of the decisions that the business makes in terms of how it wants to go forward in helping achieve its outcomes, HESTA is very strong on some of the impact areas that it's focused on. Which then drives some of the strategy and the actual outcomes that the business is trying to achieve. So from my point of view, our role is to ensure that we have the right technologies and foundations in place as we see some of those strategies play out.
Andrew, another question from the audience, and this may be our last one. We'll see how we go. Saying it's hard for funds to invest in new technology when new compliance keeps coming every year. So how can this be better managed?
Compliance is a burden for the industry, and for that reason, it doesn't make sense that every fund has a proprietary view for what their operating model is. And understanding what is available as product and what is possible in innovation at the perimeter is fundamental, like we spoke about the blueprint operating model. Not everyone can focus on the regulatory change that happens at the core. And so how do you rely on partners for that? How do you automate that as efficiently as possible? Don't recreate the wheel. And so it's only in that way that we can get scale as an industry that we'll be able to combat the cost, because the growth rate of change, regulatory change, has been near exponential in the last few years. And I think that it looks like it's going to continue.
Yeah, Sheena, I'd like to get your thoughts on that one as well. So hard to invest in new technology when compliance keeps coming every year. So how is this managed? How can it be better managed?
I think Andrew spoke to it, right? So understanding your operating model and then understanding how, how we want to deliver to that helps provide the agility and the velocity. A lot of times, we find at the receiving end, being partners in delivering to compliance requirements, data plays such a big role, and accessibility to that information, by automating processes, by creating an environment where technology is decoupled, makes change easier. Traditional technology was very bespoke, as Mark spoke to, and very specialized in different parts. But that also makes change really difficult. So I think as people think about not only their target operating model, but the architecture, right? The technology architecture that underpins that, creating flexibility in that architecture, allowing technologies to be a lot more loosely coupled, but also enabling that information to flow seamlessly will make that change a lot easier.
Look, I'm going to be a little bit cheeky and sneak in one more question. A viewer has written in saying, thank you for talking to the fund's responsibilities for advice. What do the panelists believe funds' responsibilities are in lifting financial literacy levels in our country? Mark?
Look, it's an enormous task. I think it's easy, if you have these default products, to just be a little bit apathetic towards this need. My view has always been that my job is to educate members on the things that matters. So there's a lot of things in superannuation with rules that are for us to worry about, and then there's things that are really important for the membership to worry about.
And Martin, I'll go to you to finalise. Just a thought on that one, the responsibility to really improve financial literacy in this country.
I think we can provide people with useful tools. I think that's it. I think the notion that we can fix financial advice through the Year 11 curriculum, unfortunately, there's no evidence to support that. The evidence around financial literacy globally is just heartbreaking in terms of the effectiveness of it in improving people's choices. Smart defaults, I think strong governance across funds, sense of purpose in our funds, and a real ethic in how we run funds and doing the right thing for people. Because very often those that need financial literacy most are those that are most vulnerable. And I think that's where we need to focus in terms of our efforts, and making sure that within our service delivery models, we have the capability to deal with the vulnerable, to deal with those that are on the edge of cognitive impairment, to deal with those that are going through bereavements, etc. I think that's where we can focus an awful lot of our efforts and take our purpose and bring it to life in terms of that ethic and that sense of public good that we can do. I worry about the idea that we can, as I said, use the Year 11 curriculum to do this. I think we have to be much more targeted, and we have to be there at those points of vulnerability.
Thank you. Well, listen, that is officially all we have time for. Thank you all out there for your questions. And I would like to thank our panel today. Of course, Andrew Walsh joining us from Iress, Mark Puli from ESSSuper, Sheena Peeters from HESTA, and Martin Fahy. Thank you all for a great discussion. Now, just a reminder that there are a number of great sessions coming up as part of Super Efficient this week. So check out the agenda and make sure you get along to them if they suit. And we will also be hosting a recording of the session on the event page within 24 hours. So if you would like to rewatch or share with your colleagues, you'll be able to do so as well. Thanks again for joining. Hope you have a great day.